Hello everyone and welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Today we've got a few things to discuss, including a couple more entry-level contracts being signed by a few NHL teams, some more injury updates, and some trade rumors involving the Philadelphia Flyers, Calgary Flames, and Florida Panthers, with all that coming up right now. Hello and welcome to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Today we've got a few things to discuss, and we'll start with the signings that we want to get to today. So to start with, there were a handful more signings over the past couple of days to talk about. I'm going to talk about another 4 here today. Starting with the Dallas Stars, they have signed 2022 4th-round pick Gavin White to a 3-year entry-level contract that will have an average annual value of $858,000, and the deal will kick in at the beginning of next season. So White's done a pretty good job over in the OHL. He's been a really good right-shot defenseman. Seems like he does have a possibility of a future in the NHL. Maybe it's like a third or second pair defenseman. He had a really great season last year, putting up 56 points in 66 games. Not as good this year, but he's still doing pretty good, having 38 points in 45 games. So he's doing really well in the OHL. But getting his entry-level contract is just the next step to his process at becoming an NHL player. He's probably still going to need another maybe year in juniors, and then maybe another year or two in the AHL. But in a couple of years' time, I think White could definitely challenge for like a third pair role on the Dallas Stars roster. So good signing by the Dallas Stars. I really do like the signing of Gavin White, and I think he should definitely be able to help the Stars in the future. So good for the Stars to get such a good player in the 4th round of this past year's draft. Next, over with the Washington Capitals, they signed centerman Ryan Hofer to a 3-year entry-level contract. They'll have a cap hit of $852,000 per year, and the deal begins at the start of next season. Now, Hofer, another really good player, he's been playing over in the WHL, and seems like he also has a good future and possibility of making it to the NHL. I think in time, he could probably be a good third-line center for the Washington Capitals. Hofer was the 6th-round draft selection by the Washington Capitals in this past year's draft, so getting an entry-level contract this early as a 6th-round pick is pretty good for Hofer. He had a pretty good season last year in the WHL, having 25 goals, 58 points in 67 games, but he's blown it out of the water this year, putting up 38 goals and 62 points in 57 games. So already over his goal and point total from last year, and he's played 10 less games. So really good season so far for Ryan Hofer, and I expect him to continue to do really well in the WHL. I also expect him to continue to play over in juniors for at least another season, and then maybe a year or two in the AHL. But I think in time, Hofer should be able to challenge for an NHL spot. And it would not surprise me at all if a couple of years down the road, he was a good third-line center for the Capitals. So good to see the Capitals get him signed. Over with the Pittsburgh Penguins, they signed left-shot defenseman Isaac Bellevue to a 3-year entry-level contract. They'll have an average annual value of $875,000. Now, Bellevue was a 5th-round pick in the 2021 draft, so he's already had a couple of years in juniors, and he's looking even better right now. He had a really good season last year, putting up 38 points in 67 games, which is pretty good as a defenseman. But has absolutely had a fantastic season this year over in the QMJHL, putting up 41 points in 46 games as a defenseman, nearly a point per game. So pretty good for Bellevue, and I expect him to continue to do well in the QMJHL. I could see him in time maybe be like a third pair defenseman for the Penguins. He still needs a couple of years in juniors and probably a couple more years in the AHL, so not anywhere soon, I would say. But getting his entry-level contract was the first step in getting him to the NHL, and I think that's a really good win for the Penguins and Bellevue. So really good signing there. Good to see some of these later round draft picks like Hofer as a 6th-rounder and Bellevue as a 5th-rounder being signed to entry-level contracts. That's really good news for a lot of these young players, but also good for these teams to get some of their younger players locked up. And lastly here with Hunter Haight, who was a 2nd-round pick in this year's draft, the 2022 draft, by the Minnesota Wild. He was signed to a 3-year entry-level contract that will have an average annual value of $898,000, and the 3-year entry-level contract will begin at the beginning of next season. Now, out of these 4 players, I think Haight was the most likely to get an NHL contract right now. Haight was a 2nd-round draft selection from last year and looks really, really good. Had 41 points in 63 games last year, already has 50 points this year in only 56 games. So he's almost a point per game pace. He's doing really well. He looks like a possible middle 6 center in a couple of seasons for the Wild. It was a really great draft selection by the Minnesota Wild to take Haight, so to get him signed is really good. I would expect him to possibly continue to play maybe another season in juniors, but it wouldn't surprise me if he plays a year or two in the AHL. after this year. And I think in a couple of years' time, especially given the fact that the Wild don't have a really great center depth at the moment, except for a guy like Marco Rossi, I could see Haight be like a second or third line center in a couple of years' time for the Wild. I don't think that would be too surprising. So to get Haight signed is a really good win for the Wild, and I expect Haight to continue to do well over in juniors and try and push for an NHL spot in a couple of years' time. But good to see the Wild sign Haight, the Stars sign White, the Capitals sign Hofer, and the Penguins sign Bellevue. So good to see all these guys get entry-level contracts. These are definitely not the only guys who are going to get signed over the next little while. The college season for a couple of teams are going to be over in the next couple of weeks. Some of those college players are going to sign with their NHL clubs. So these are definitely not the only players that are going to be signing entry-level contracts. But good to see these 4 players and juniors get entry-level contracts, and hopefully they can make the NHL in the not-too-distant future. Now that's all the signings I want to get to today. Next, we go over to the injury update part of the video. We'll start with the Detroit Red Wings, as they've had a few injury updates. As Jordan Oesterle has been activated off of injury reserve and gotten back into game action, as has Ville Husso. But Robbie Fabry has suffered an injury and is going to be out for a little bit of time. So to start with Oesterle, he was placed on injury reserve. He was also undisclosed injury, but he was back within like a week of being placed on injury reserve. So I think it's a little surprising that Oesterle was back so quickly, but it was really good for the Red Wings. Oesterle is a really good third pair, 7th defenseman for the Detroit Red Wings. So good to see him get back into game action and not miss too much time due to his injury. He was suffering with an undisclosed injury, and there was an unknown period of time, so it was really cloudy to see when he would get back. But to see him get back that quickly is really good. And hopefully he can continue to be a really good third pair defenseman for the Red Wings. Over in net, the Red Wings had Ville Husso suffer a undisclosed injury, and he was going to be out day to day. But only like 2 to 3 days later, he was already healthy and back into game action. So good to see Husso get back into game action. He's been their starting goaltender this year. Nedeljkovic hasn't done overly well, and Hellberg's their backup. So after signing him in the offseason, Husso's definitely run with a starting job in Detroit this year, and I expect him to continue to do really well. And with the Red Wings fighting for a playoff spot, they need the best goaltending they can get right now. So to get Husso back and not miss him for an overly long period of time is really, really good for the Red Wings. And lastly for the Red Wings, Robbie Fabry has suffered a lower body injury and is going to be out for an unknown period of time. So not really great news for Fabry. He's been a really good middle six forward ever since coming back off of injury reserve to start the season. Fabry looks like a really good player, and he looks like a really good piece for the Detroit Red Wings forward group. So to lose him for any period of time is not really great. Once again, he's going to be out for an unknown period of time, so really, really hard to pinpoint when he could be back. But hopefully it's only a game or two that he's out, and he's back in the near future, because Fabry's a really big piece of that organization in Detroit and that forward group. And with the Red Wings pushing for a playoff spot, they need all the help they can get, and hopefully Fabry can get back into game action. So not great news that Fabry is out, and hopefully he can return in the next game or two. But to get Oesterle and Husso back after short stints with injuries is really great news, and hopefully the Red Wings can continue to push for a playoff spot. Next is the Minnesota Wild. They've had good and bad news on the injury front, as Marcus Foligno has returned from his injury, but Brandon Duhaime and Kirill Kaprizov are both injured right now and could miss a little bit of time due to injuries. Now for Foligno, he suffered a lower body injury, was only out for about a week, and then returned to game action. So Foligno's definitely been in and out of the lineup this year due to injuries. So to see him get back really quickly after suffering an injury is really good. Foligno has been a really good middle six winger this year. Really, really tough to play against player. So hopefully Foligno isn't too rusty and he can continue to be a really good force for the Minnesota Wild on that forward group and continue to help the Wild push for a top spot in the Central. As for the injuries to Kaprizov and Duhaime, these don't look too good. Duhaime suffered a head injury. He's going to be out for an unknown period of time. It didn't look good when he suffered the injury. It's quite possible he could be out for maybe like a game or two. But given the unknown period of time, all the other stuff that happened for Duhaime, I think it could be more like a week or two. So not great news for Duhaime. Hopefully he gets back in the near future, but I think it could be a little bit more longer term. As for Kaprizov, he went down in last night's game for the Wild due to a lower body injury. He's also going to be out for an unknown period of time, so there's no real timeline for him at this point. Hopefully Kaprizov isn't out for too long. He's that driving force on the Wild offense, and it was a really big piece of this Wild team. So losing Kaprizov for any amount of time right now is not going to be good. So hopefully he can get back in the near future, and he's not out for overly long. But just really bad news for the Wild to lose Kaprizov. I mean, he's the driving force of that offense, and losing him for any significant period of time is going to be a huge loss for the Wild. So good to see Foligno get back. He's been in and out of the lineup due to injuries. Hopefully he can stay healthy and continue to be a good middle six winger for the Wild. But losing Duhaime to a head injury, not great. And losing Kaprizov to a lower body injury is even worse. So hopefully Kaprizov and Duhaime can get back in the near future, as the Wild are challenging the Stars for a top spot in the Central Division. And hopefully the Wild can continue to do well, even if they miss Kaprizov for a couple of games. But losing Kaprizov for any significant period of time is going to be awful. And hopefully Kaprizov can get back in the near future and get back into game action. Next, with the Montreal Canadiens, they've had a couple of injury updates, as they got Joel Edmondson and Chris Weidman back off of injuries. They have lost for the time being Kane Guhle and Justin Barron. Now for Edmondson, he had missed just over a month due to upper body injury. He was originally listed as day-to-day, but he missed over a month, so it wasn't really good for Edmondson. He was able to get back in game action just before the trade line, and he's played a couple of games now. So getting Edmondson back is really good. He's a really key piece of that top four at the moment for the Canadiens, and he's a really good veteran leader on this team. So to lose him for any significant period of time was not great, but now they get Edmondson back, who should be a really good force and a really good leader for the Canadiens on that blue line. Same thing with Weidman. He only missed like a week and a half, but he was placed on injury reserve, so they're able to activate him off of injury reserve, get him back from his upper body injury, and have him return to game action. So really good for Weidman. He's been a good third pair seventh defenseman this year, so really good to see him get back, especially with a couple of other guys injured right now. He could definitely slot back into a third pair role and help that Canadiens blue line. The Canadiens, though, have suffered a couple more injuries to younger players. Guhle, who was recently coming off a 2-month absence due to an injury, and Justin Barron, who was called up with guys like Guhle, Xhekaj, and Edmondson out due to all those injuries on the blue line, have both suffered upper body injuries and are both out day-to-day. Now, the day-to-day timeline is good. I don't expect them to be out for overly too long. Hopefully it's just the next game or two, and they can get back within the next week. So hopefully Guhle and Barron are not going to be injured for too long a period of time. Those two are really good young players and seem to have a really bright future with the Canadiens organization. So to lose them for any period of time is not going to be great. So hopefully they can get back into game action in the near future and they're not out too long. But definitely, losing top 4 defensemen like Kane Guhle and a top 6 defenseman like Justin Barron to injuries, especially with them being good young players, is not great. And hopefully they can recover in the near future so they can get back into game action and continue to get some NHL experience. But good to see Edmondson and Weidman get back, but bad news to see Guhle and Barron go down with injury, and hopefully they'll only miss a game or two and they're back into game action and not missing too much, as they're really good young players. And hopefully these good young players don't miss too much time and can get back and get some more NHL experience before the season is over. And lastly, here with the Tampa Bay Lightning, they have a few injury updates, as Pierre-Edouard Bellemare and Victor Hedman are both injured right now, but they were able to get back Erik Cernak off of injuries. So for Cernak, he was out due to a lower body injury for just about a week, missed a couple of games due to it, but he was able to get back recently, and he's gone back into a top 4 role. So to get Cernak back is really good. He's a really big piece of that Bolts top 4. So good to see Cernak get back. Hopefully he can help stabilize that Bolts D-core, but it is a little bit concerning that they did lose Victor Hedman due to a undisclosed injury. Now, Hedman's only day-to-day, so hopefully he's only out for a game or two and he's back in the next week. But it could be a couple of weeks' time before Hedman gets back. So hopefully it's not overly long and he can get back in the near future. But I expect it to be not overly long period of time Hedman will be out, but it's quite possible it could be at least a week, maybe a week and a half before Hedman gets back. So that's a really big blow to the Bolts D-core. And finally here with Pierre-Edouard Bellemare, he suffered an undisclosed injury. He's also out day-to-day right now. So hopefully Bellemare can get back in the near future. He's a really good fourth-line center for the Lightning. The Lightning have gotten a few players at the trade deadline to sort of help that forward group. So I wouldn't be too worried about Bellemare being injured right now. He should be back in a week, maybe 2 weeks. So I would expect Bellemare will be back in the near future, and for the time being, they should be able to make do with the forwards they have right now. But really good news to see Cernak get back from his injury and help that defense out a lot. But the loss of Hedman is extremely going to hurt the Bolts D-core, and Bellemare is another forward body that they don't have healthy right now. So hopefully Belmar and Hedman can get back in the near future, but it is good to see Trinidad get back. And hopefully the Bolts can continue to get healthier. They're sort of slipping a little bit right now, and hopefully they can continue to play well and do some more damage before the playoffs start. So this is all the injury updates I want to talk about for today. And lastly, here we go over to the trade rumor part of the video. We'll start with the Philadelphia Flyers. Now, there was a lot of talk going into the trade deadline and around the trade deadline that James Van Reimsdyk would be dealt. But surprisingly, he wasn't. Now, I just want to go a little bit more in depth to see what sort of happened. Now, there was a couple of reports right around the trade deadline, about an hour before, that he was going to be shipped to the Detroit Red Wings. But then that didn't happen. The deal fell apart. It sounded like the Red Wings had some sort of a deal in place, but needed something else to get done. Now, the Red Wings have been a seller, so I don't really think that the Red Wings would want a James Van Reimsdyk. It's quite possible that they did, but I think it would be more likely that they would have tried to flip him to another team, because a lot of teams were really cap-strapped, and they could have used James Van Reimsdyk, but at a good like $1.75 million cap hit, so I think that's possible, but it just didn't seem like Detroit could find a place for him to go. Now, if you look at who had the most interest in James Van Reimsdyk, the more talked about teams who had interest in James Van Reimsdyk were the Vegas Golden Knights, the Winnipeg Jets, and the Minnesota Wild. If you look at what they did prior to the deadline, Minnesota went out and acquired Johansson from Washington, Nyquist from Columbus, and Sundqvist from Detroit. Winnipeg went out and acquired Nemesnikov from San Jose and Niederreiter from Nashville. And Vegas went out and acquired Barbashev from St. Louis and Bluger from Pittsburgh. So if you look at this, I just think the Flyers may have run out of options. With so many of these fringe teams turning into sellers, like the Predators, the Blues, the Caps, and the Red Wings, it just seemed like there were more options for these teams. If you look at the Wild, they were able to get Johansson from Washington and Sundqvist from Detroit, who are really good middle six forwards. So if those two aren't available, I could definitely see James Van Reimsdyk go to Minnesota. Winnipeg was able to get Niederreiter for this year and next year. If Nashville wasn't sellers, I could see Winnipeg going after James Van Reimsdyk. Vegas got Barbashev, which was their big addition. If St. Louis was a little bit higher in the standings and wasn't going to move a guy like Barbashev, I could definitely see James Van Reimsdyk going to Vegas. So while there was speculation that he was going to be traded, I just think the Flyers ran out of options with Van Reimsdyk, and I think that's probably the main reason why he wasn't traded. Also, too, they were probably asking for like a third-round pick, and there probably wasn't very many teams who would have wanted that at his cap hit. So there's probably definitely a couple of reasons here, but I think given all the sellers and where some of these teams who are interested in JVR went, I just don't think that there was really much of a market at the end of the deadline for James Van Reimsdyk. So I think that's really what sealed his fate with Philadelphia. And I do wonder if the Red Wings really wanted to acquire him, or if they were going to try and flip him to another team. So it's going to be interesting to see how JVR finishes out the season in Philadelphia. He is still a pending unrestricted free agent, so for now he'll just finish up his season in Philadelphia, and hopefully in the offseason he can get a new contract elsewhere and he can go play somewhere else. But I think other teams going in other directions, with a couple of other teams turning sellers, is really what helped keep JVR with the Flyers. Next was Kevin Hayes. Hayes was a guy who was widely speculated to be possibly traded. If not traded, then a trade or buyout candidate in the offseason. Hayes was apparently drawing a little bit of interest. There was definitely a couple of teams who had interest in like a second-line center like Hayes. And I think there were a lot of teams who liked a guy like Hayes. Now, he never got moved. The Flyers didn't move him. But there's still a lot of talk that he could be moved by the draft. Hayes is still having one heck of a season. Had 31 points in 48 games last year. Dealt with injuries, off-ice problems. He had a lot of other stuff going on with his life last year. This year, he's done absolutely fantastic. 49 points in 63 games, a point away from a career high of 50 points. So he's had one heck of a season. And I think at a reduced cap hit, there would be a lot of interest. If the Flyers could bump his cap hit down to maybe like a $5.5 million, I think there would definitely be a ton of teams interested. But the one team that a lot of people are linking to Kevin Hayes would be the Columbus Blue Jackets. There were some that were saying that the Jackets and Flyers were talking. Some are speculating that that was probably around Kevin Hayes. The Jackets seem to want to improve that center group. They have a guy like Boone Jenner and Jack Roslovic who are okay centers. And they have a couple of guys like Sillinger and Kent Johnson who seem to be future top six centers. But at this point in their careers really aren't that much of a top six center. So getting a veteran center who can fill in the role for the now and the next couple of years while Johnson and Sillinger continue to grow. It would be a really big win for the Jackets, and it seems like they'd be willing to acquire Kevin Hayes. I mean, imagine Hayes centering a line with Gaudreau and Laine. That would be a really good offensive line for that Blue Jackets team. So it does seem like there's some speculation that Hayes could wind up being traded to the Jackets in the offseason, and he has been linked to Columbus due to some ties with guys like Johnny Gaudreau and Rick Nash. So I think it's very, very likely that Hayes is either dealt or possibly bought out by the Flyers in the offseason. But I think they would much rather go the trade option if they can. So I definitely think Hayes will be dealt. It's just a matter of where, and it does seem like the Blue Jackets have interest. So this is going to be an interesting thing to watch over the offseason and see if Hayes is dealt and if it is the Blue Jackets. Well, let us know what you think. Does Hayes get dealt, or is he a buyout option in the offseason? And if so, where do you think Hayes would wind up? And lastly here, just going to talk a little bit about the Calgary Flames and the Florida Panthers. Both teams really just stood pat at the deadline. Panthers only made one in-season move, and that was back in December, acquiring Giovanni Smith from Detroit. And the Flames only made two deadline moves, acquiring Dryden Hunt from the Maple Leafs in exchange for Adam Zohorna, and swapping the Ritchie brothers, getting Nick from Arizona for Brett. So both these teams, who were speculated to possibly be moving a couple of pieces, really didn't do much. So it's going to be interesting to see what these two teams do in the offseason. The Flames, they're going to have a lot of players entering the final year of the contract after July 1st. They're going to have a guy like Michael Backlund, Elias Lindholm, Dylan Dubé, Oliver Shillington, Chris Tanev, Noah Hannafin. So there's a ton of players. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Flames tried to shake up that roster at least a little bit more and maybe move a couple of guys out. I think they would probably keep a guy like Lindholm and Hannafin and probably Tanev too. But I think for a couple of other guys who would be entering the final year of their contract, they could be moved, like maybe a Michael Backlund, maybe a Dylan Dubé, maybe Oliver Shillington. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think the Flames are going to be a really interesting team to watch come the season, as the Flames have a lot of players in the final year of their contract. So the Flames still look like an okay team. They're currently on the outside looking in right now in the playoffs. So I definitely think if they miss the playoffs, there will be some change coming to the Calgary Flames to try and rework that roster. Definitely don't know exactly what sort of changes they'll be doing. There was also some talk before the deadline of Uyghur, so it's going to be interesting to see, but I think the Flames are going to be a really interesting team to watch and could move a couple of really key players who are going to be entering the final year of their deals. And lastly, with the Florida Panthers, there was some talk that they would move at least one of Sam Reinhart, Sam Bennett, or Anthony Duclair before the deadline. That didn't happen. So I would expect one of these guys to be moved in the offseason. The Panthers are definitely trying to clear at least a little bit of cap space to go after some more defense. I know they've had an okay defense this year, but it's definitely not to the extent they had last year after the Ben Chirata addition, after having Mackenzie Weegar. That defense looks really bleak this year. So I would expect them to move maybe one or two of Duclair, Bennett, Reinhart in the offseason. The Patrick Hornqvist contract expires as well, so they're going to get some money off of their books, and I expect them to try and use some of that money to go after defensemen to try and improve that top four. So I think Florida's going to be another interesting team to watch. I think they'll probably move out at least one, maybe two decent priced defensemen and use that money to go after a top four defenseman. So I think the Panthers are definitely also going to be another team to watch around the trade line, maybe also in free agency. So keep an eye on the Flames and the Panthers in the offseason. I will expect them to both be really busy teams after a very quiet deadline, and I could easily see both of them be really decent players at like the draft or in free agency. So definitely keep an eye on the Flames and Panthers. I will let you know what you think in the offseason, what sort of moves you think the Panthers and Flames can make, and which sort of players you think could get traded. But that's all I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video and subscribe. I also do a blog, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. And I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.